Okay, and since this is the FOX43 Book Club, we're all about ties to central Pennsylvania. Can you tell us about your ties to Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Currently live in Harrisburg, but essentially I've spent most of my life in central PA.
Awesome. And what inspired New Avalon / setting it in Pennsylvania?
Growing up, I was a big Stephen King fan, and Stephen King sets all of his books in Maine, where he lives, and I guess that part of just kind of seeped over into my own writing, where it's like, okay, I live in Pennsylvania, so the majority of my books take place in PA.
Very cool. And I know that like authors kind of tend to write what they know, so to speak. So like, is this book autobiographical at all?
No. Pure fiction.
Pure fiction. Love it. Okay.
Well, so I wouldn't say it's autobiographical, but I would say obviously there's always aspects of life that bleed through.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain things that I could probably point out, like when I was writing the book, that was probably happening in my life, or someone, or people around me that I would use it for inspiration. So I would say in a way, it's not necessarily autobiographical, but it is, certain characters or situations might be inspired by things that actually happened in real life.
Very cool. And can you talk about whoever you consider to be the two main characters and like the inspiration behind them, how you built their personalities, that sort of thing?
So for New Avalon, it's about a man who essentially walks away from his past life to be a bodyguard for somebody. I mean, I don't know, at this point, do we want to spoil?
If you want, totally up to you.
So this is a book that I'd written a long time ago at this point. It initially started out as a short story. It basically plays with the idea that Princess Diana had cancer, and she didn't want to necessarily waste away in front of the world. And so her death was basically manufactured so she and Dodi Al-Fayed could just disappear and basically spend their remaining days. And they went across the ocean and ended up in a very small town in I think it's been a while, but I want to say it's like up in like northern PA. And so several people, of course, had to come along with them, and they also, basically started new lives. And so the main character here that we focus on, he walked away from his life as a police officer, and basically is now her bodyguard. And so he's the main character. There are a few other more secondary characters. We never really explicitly say it's Princess Diana, mm-hmm. or even Dodi Al-Fayed. We always say it's, I think, like, because it's written in second person, he always calls him his friend, or, your friend says this. But it's kind of clear. But the book doesn't really focus so much on her, but it focuses on the main character, who initially we learn his name is John, but that's his new name. Mm-hmm. So even though there are, a few other characters here and there, there's a doctor that appears, which I guess if I have to say a secondary character would potentially be him when it comes to page time. But it's really more focused on him. Because again, it started out as a short story, but it was a very maybe like a first chapter, and I always knew I wanted to do more with it. Mm-hmm. So I ended up expanding it into what it became.
Very cool. I like to write, and I always find myself stuck on short stories, because I'm like, okay, I have like this one scene, and I don't know what happens before or what happens after, but here's what's in the middle.
Yeah.
And then why, you were talking about it being in second person, why did you decide to write the book that way?
I've always been a fan of second person. Stuart Onan's A Prayer for the Dying is a novel that was written in second person. Of course, there's the, I always get it mixed up. I mentioned it in the very back of the book, so let me see here. I think it's Bright Lights, Big City. I always want to mix those up, but Bright Lights, Big City was a famous book that's also been in second person. And occasionally, I feel like second person is very effective when it's utilized correctly. Mm-hmm. A lot of readers are not used to it because they don't see it often, so it often scares them off. I feel like nowadays, though, it's becoming a little bit more mainstream. You're seeing it, and there was a book that came out, I think, last year called The Quiet Tenant, which half of it was written in second person. And again, I think it's just an effective way to tell a story. I've found that when writing books, sometimes, at this point I've written so many that I just get a sense before I start the best point of view. But there are times where, again, writing short stories or whatever else, I might start writing it in a first person or third person and then realize it just doesn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And so for this one, I think initially the short story was written in first person, but there was just something about the voice that just didn't feel right. And so I had tried it then in second person, and it just felt more natural. And so it just then, of course, expanding the short story into the novel, I just went with that. So specifically why this one is the second person, well, and let me just, also because the way again, the main character, he walks away from his old life, and so he has a new life. And so it opens up with the first line is, "Sometimes you forget who you're supposed to be." It says, "This happens early in the mornings, an hour before your alarm clock buzzes, the bedroom cold and dark and still. Faint sunlight slices through the narrow openings between the window blinds. It takes a moment, wondering if you're awake or if you're still dreaming, if all of this is just a dream. And then you blink and remember who you are, or rather, who you're supposed to be." So again, I think because we have that almost this detachment of who the character is, it made more sense to do it in second person.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that until you said that, but that makes a lot of sense. And then can you talk about like your writing process, or like what a typical like writing day would look like for you?
It really depends, I think, on the project. I'm a procrastinator, so usually I like having a deadline, so that way I really have to force myself to work. I'm also a really fast writer, at least when it comes to first drafts, and I'm a fast typer too. So usually I try to do the Nora Roberts vomit draft method, where I just want to get the story out as quickly as possible. I'm not going back every day and going back through what I wrote and trying to edit as I go. I just want to get the story out. I typically don't outline. I've had to for a few projects here and there that required it, and it's not my thing. I know some writers it works for them, which is fine. I really just like starting with either a character or a situation, to just seeing what happens. Because for me, I always find that it's interesting when the characters start doing things I don't really intend on them to do or even want them to do, but it just feels more natural a character would say or do one thing or another. And then all of a sudden the story goes in a completely different direction than what I initially anticipated. It's not to say that I don't necessarily kind of know where I want to go. I always like to use the Harlan Coben example of, I think it's like you're on a road trip, you know you're starting in New Jersey because that's where he lives, and you're going to do like a cross-country trip to California. So you know where you're starting, you know where you're going to end up, but how you get there, what happens along the way, that's up to whatever happens. So that usually is, and then sometimes when I am really going at it, I could do I never really try to do like word counts. It's usually maybe like a chapter a day, 2 chapters. It really depends on what I can force myself. And I think it's always important to remember too that first drafts are meant to be awful. Mm-hmm. So I think it's oftentimes writers get in this mindset that they want their first draft to be perfect. And I think once you are able to accept the fact that the very first draft is not going to be good, it gives you a little bit, it puts less pressure on you as the writer to expect the perfection. Because perfection comes, when you're editing, when you're trying to, 10 drafts in or whatever it takes to get, as closer to the end product. But that very first draft is meant to be sloppy. So I think, but still, having said that, there are times where I still, I want my first draft to be as perfect as possible, but it's just, it's something to have to get past, I guess, as you're writing.
Good advice. And you are like writing around a day job too. Like, how do you balance that out, or are you just writing? With day job, in a way, it actually I think is better because I have then less time at night that forces me to really want to find time. Because there are times where, I might be off for a couple of days or whatever else, and just having all that extra time,
I mean, not having, I guess, the structure. I mean, maybe I guess if I was writing full time and really it was what I had to do to pay the bills, it would be a little bit different. Yeah, I mean, it's mostly just making the time. I mean, oftentimes I'll hear from writers where they're just like, I don't have time to write a book. And it's, you know, it's not like you're expected to write the book in a week or a day. I mean, if you sit down, you write even a page, or quite honestly, even a paragraph or two. Sometimes writers do that. I know one writer on his commute to work on the train, he'll like pull up his iPhone and just, you know, jot down a few paragraphs. I mean, so it's really just trying to, and also, it's also one of those things too, just time management. I mean, you have to ask yourself, like, do I really need to, you know, rewatch, you know, The Office for the 10th time? You know, no, I can step away for an hour and, you know, try to write something. So, yeah, it's mostly just finding the time.
It's funny that you said it about the train. One of our other authors that we interviewed, Taj Magruder, he said the same thing. He commutes on the train from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, and he's like, every time I just open up my laptop and I'm typing away.
Yeah, I had to go, it was last year, I think, and again, it helps when I'm on deadline where, you know, I have to have a book finished by a certain period. I went to New York from Harrisburg, and I took my iPad and keyboard and was just, you know, writing on the train. So it's just, and again, it's, you know, it's not a very, you know, I mean, I had noise canceling headphones on, but, you know, I mean, the train is swaying and whatever else, but it's just, you kind of get into the rhythm of it. And again, you just have to always remind yourself, like, it doesn't have to be perfect the first time.
Yeah.
Or even the second time or third time. I mean, again, you know, it's just kind of just, again, having that mindset that, you know, the thing about books is they're always evolving as you're writing them. I know writers who will just go through like 20, 30 drafts, and they're probably still not happy with. I mean, even this one, the most recent book, I mean, up until the last minute, I was tinkering, you know, going through, I'm sure it drove the publisher crazy, where it was just like, you know, until the very last minute, I was going back through the book, you know, changing a word or here or there, you know, in terms of the flow or anything else, just because, you know, especially as we near publication, I want it to be as perfect as possible. But again, on that first draft, I know that's not, you know, that's not feasible.
And have you noticed your writing style like change or develop over the years in the books?
Yeah, I would like to think that my writing has gotten a lot tighter. You know, and I mean, I love Stephen King, and, you know, nothing against Stephen King, but you know, having read a lot of Stephen King growing up, you know, he uses a lot of words, where in retrospect, you know, some of the books probably could be shorter, a lot of scene choice. I mean, oftentimes, so one of the very first things I had ever, I guess, had published book form was an anthology called Hint Fiction, an anthology in an anthology of stories in 25 words or fewer. Because I had come up with this term, Hint Fiction, which was inspired by the Ernest Hemingway 6-word story, For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn. And so that started thinking about how short can you make a story until it's no longer considered a story. And so around that time, I'd also been writing a lot of flash fiction and just this idea of what's needed. So as I started writing my short stories and then novels, I started really getting into like the scene choice, like, or even the chapters. If you can take out a chapter, if you can take out a scene, if you can take out a character and the story doesn't really change, it doesn't really hurt the story, then why is that chapter, that scene, that character there in the first place? So it was one of those things that now I really am more conscious of it than I was a long time ago. One of the books, I remember I had this one scene, there were these two, I think it was FBI agents, and doing something, and the editor at one point was like, why do you need two of them? Because one can just do the job of two of them. And I was like, okay. So again, just that idea of just always asking yourself why. You know, why is my main character doing this? Why is this chapter here? Why is this scene here? And of course, from why comes other questions like, well, how is this going to happen? You know, what is the end goal? You know, certain stuff like that. But I would definitely think that I like to try to just make, you know, things a lot tighter. And also going along with the Elmer Leonard 10 Rules of Writing, his most famous rule from that was leave out the parts readers tend to skip. And so I'm sure we've all read books where we just find ourselves bored and skimming and skimming and skimming. And I really try to write books where you can't skim because they're just so compelling that you just want to keep reading. I also try to, the more white space on the page, the better. Because I feel like, especially nowadays with people's, I'm going to say just ADHD, but I mean, just, you know, I mean, we're in a world where essentially everyone is on their phones all the time, they're on tablets, they're on social media. I feel like when you read a book, when you read old books, oftentimes, you know, you'll open it up and it's just going to be a long paragraph, like every page is just these long, long paragraphs. And I feel like nowadays that is something that really, a lot of writers or a lot of readers probably won't admit it, but I feel that oftentimes when they open books like that, they kind of inwardly groan because they're like, oh. So what happens though is, so I try to keep, now that's not to say I don't write long paragraphs at times. I certainly do for either, you know, if there's an action scene or if it's just the flow of what's going on. But I do try to stay, you know, keep it very in the back of my head that I want to keep kind of shorter paragraphs. I've recently tried to really cut back on speech tags. So it's not always like, you know, we have he said, she said, or he whispered or she whispered. Sometimes obviously they're needed, but oftentimes I think it's very clear who's speaking. And so, especially when it comes to audiobooks, I love audiobooks, I listen to audiobooks all the time, and I think sometimes it's very clear certain writers, they don't actually listen to audiobooks because you'll have two characters speaking and there are just speech tags back and forth between two characters, which is not needed. And it becomes very annoying when you're listening because it's not like when you're reading, you can just, you know, your eye can just skim over them. You know, when it comes to an audiobook narrator, they have to read what is written. So that's something I'm also more conscious of.
Yeah, you don't want that repetitive blah, 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 blah.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the thing too. I mean, when it comes down to flow, especially when, you know, when you're, if you listen to audiobooks, you can tell when a writer really knows what they're doing because there's not awkward sentences. Yeah, just everything is just flowing really well. And so that's this thing too, that when I'm also writing, when I get to a certain stage, I will read my work aloud. I mean, I'm in my office by myself, doors closed, but I'll read it to make sure that there is, you know, like a good flow, that we don't, you know, that there's not any place where the reader's all of a sudden going to pause because they come across like a weird phrase or word, because you just want to keep them going. If there's anything that slows them down, you know, they might decide, oh, you know what, I have to go check the laundry, and then they'll put it down and might not come back to it for a while. So you just want to get them in a rhythm where they're just, you know, have to turn the page, or if, you know, you're on your Kindle or whatever, just, you know, click to the next section, I guess.
Smart. And did you always want to be an author? Like, what was sort of your journey to getting here?
Yeah, so I was in the 6th grade when the very first Jurassic Park movie came out, and you know, I forget how old was I in 6th grade, but like, you know, that was a life changing. It was one of those things where it was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. And at that point, I had always read books, but from there, I started reading all Michael Crichton books, and then even a lot of the books that he'd written under a pen name. And so I started reading all of his books, and then from there, I read my very first Stephen King book in 8th grade, I believe, Insomnia, which is not really, I think, the best Stephen King book to be your very first Stephen King book, because it's very thick, very complex. It deals a lot with the Dark Tower mythos, so if you're not familiar at all with any of those other books, some of the stuff might not make sense. But I loved it, and I remember finishing it and just thinking like, okay, this is what I want to do with my life. So from there, you know, I was just always writing short stories in high school and college, and written first book, and then just as always, just the thing I always had the passion for.
Cool. And then, do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it sounds cheesy, but it's just, you know, you just can't give up. If that's what you really want to do, it's just, you have to put in the work. Like, it's not easy. Oftentimes I'll hear writers complain like, oh, it's, you know, it's hard to write a book. It's like, well, yes, it's hard to write a book. It's you know, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. Oftentimes people think they can do it, but when they sit down and actually start doing it, they find that it's not that easy. So yeah, I mean, it's mostly just having, you know, you really have to have that passion, because it's also not an easy thing to do, and also just be prepared for a lot of rejection, especially if you're writing short stories, poems, novels. Very rarely do authors send out or submit a book or a short story and the very first editor, publisher accepts it. Oftentimes there's rejection. So it's just getting into, you know, just accepting that it's not necessarily that the work is bad. I mean, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just, it's not right for that market. Sometimes maybe that magazine or publisher just recently, you know, purchased or acquired something very similar, and they, you know, they can't add it to their list. Also, if you're able to, a lot of like magazines out there often have what they call slush readers. So it's people who just read those unsolicited stories that come in. For a long time, for several years, I had worked as an editor for a friend of mine. He had this this kind of horror, dark fantasy magazine. This was back, you know, again, like in I think high school, college, when I was writing more horror, supernatural stuff, and just reading just stories, not good stories. Really, I feel it helps you see what not to do, because oftentimes people are reading stuff that's been published, stuff that's been edited, you know, over and over, and that's polished. But then actually reading things that are nowhere near ready to be published or nowhere near polished really gives you a good sense of, well, yeah, again, like what not to do. So I always also recommend that if possible.
Makes sense. And now, you just had a new book come out.
Yes.
Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so Enemy of the State is the follow-up to the first book in the series. That was called Enemy of the, that was called The Killing Room. The Killing Room actually was fortunate earlier this year, won the International Thriller Writers Thriller Award. So that was neat.
Awesome.
So this one, though, so it's always hard to talk about these books because for me, I've written several books where, like I have a female assassin series, and you pick it up and you know exactly what that book is going to be as soon as you pick it up. It's like a Jack Reacher novel. When you pick up a Jack Reacher novel, you know what you're getting when you go into it. At the same time, I love reading books, and I also love writing books where you don't really know what's going to happen. You think you know what's going to happen, but what happens is completely different. So with The Killing Room, the setup of The Killing Room is we had a businessman in Las Vegas who wakes up in a hotel room that's not his, with no memory of the night before, and he finds a dead woman in the bathtub. He clearly is freaked out, doesn't really know what to do, feels like I had nothing to do with this, and just decides to run. And finally, some police detectives manage to track him down before he's able to make it out of the city, and that's like the first 40, 50 pages. So you think it's going to be this type of story, but then I want to say 80, 90 pages in, there's this huge twist, and all of a sudden it becomes a completely different type of story. And so I had a lot of fun with that, which also makes it hard to talk about. And it also makes it hard to talk about this one. But I will say that this, though, picks up right where that one leaves off. The first book, there's definitely a beginning, middle, and end. However, I sort of end on this epilogue that kind of leaves it on a cliffhanger that leads you right into the second book. I often try to do that with especially series books, kind of think about like a moral end credits type thing that sets you up for what's going to happen in the next one. So that's what happened in the first book. And then, so Enemy of the State picks up right where that one leaves off. And this one is very much, if you just read this one, you know what you're getting going into it, especially based on the back cover. It's hard to talk about the back cover because it ruins some, you get some spoilers, because I've heard from some readers who will say, oh, I read this one and now I'm going to go back and read the first one. It's like, well, okay, you can still, I'm sure, enjoy the first book, but it's going to be a different experience than having gone into the first book blind and then going straight to this one. Um, I will say there's just it opens up with just nonstop action. There's a lot of action in it. Again, going back to how my writing has changed, um, I just try to just again have just that compelling narrative throughout. Just there's just constant movement. There's never really and if there is any point where things slow down or we have to do like a flashback, it's clearly like meant to be there. Because again, I always try to say like, do I need this? Can I, and there's, I think there was even maybe in this book, but there have been times where I've deleted entire chapters.
Wow.
Where I've just realized, in fact, a book that I was editing that I just sent to my agent recently, there was a chapter, I mean, it was probably 5-6 pages. I just realized I could probably just, summarize this in a couple paragraphs. I do not need all of this time. I think again for writers, I think it's good when you're able to acknowledge that. Do I wish I had thought about that before I spent all that time working on that chapter? Of course, but I mean sometimes you have to write things to understand that they're not needed, that happens a lot too.
It's good to be self-aware like that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, but I mean, still, there are times where then maybe my agent or another editor or even like a writer friend of mine who reads early drafts might point something out to me where, at the time I think like, oh no, this is great. And then they're like, well, what about this? And it's like, oh, okay. And I mean, and that happens too. There's that, I forget who came up with the phrase, but it was like that idea of kill your darlings. I mean, there are times where I've written what I thought were really cool, maybe action sequences or cool chapters or really, and just ultimately you realize it's not, again, how does it better serve the story? How does it serve the book? How does it better serve the characters? And if the answer is essentially just like, well, it better serves me, the author, because I really like it, that's not a good answer.
And you can give me as many or as few details as you like, but do you have any plans for any future books?
So this one, it does leave it open for another book, but right now, I guess, as is usually the case with like 2 book deals that you have with a publisher, you have to see how things go. But you definitely, I think the character, and actually there are several different characters too, I definitely have an idea for where I would take them. But right now, nothing is, nothing's been contracted. I haven't started working. I mean, what I've been working on currently are other projects.
Exciting. Do you want to talk about them at all? If not, that's okay. But.
So I also write under a pseudonym. A lot of my, so I mentioned, Stephen King. So a lot of my early stuff, I thought I was going to be a horror writer at the time. Because again, Stephen King was a horror writer. So a lot of my early stuff was horror, supernatural, but there was always a bent of like a thriller action in it. And I think it's mostly just having grown up in the 90s, a lot of like, just watching action 90s action movies. And I think my novel, was it Man of Wax was the very first one where it was just straight thriller. And then, from there, I had The Serial Killer's Wife. I had No Shelters, the first female assassin book. And I think everything since then has just been straight thriller. But I also write psychological suspense. Excuse me. And those are written under a pseudonym, Avery Bishop. So there's Girl Gone Mad, One Year Gone, and Dear Serafina. And currently wrapping up a project with Audible. It's going to be an Audible original novel. Don't think they've not really announced it yet, so I can't really say what the title is, but it's a really fun project, and that should come out hopefully sometime. I thought it was going to come out this year, but I guess we're looking at now next year. So that will definitely be coming out next year. And then obviously working on some other stuff, which is so early stages, it's really hard to talk about, because I don't want to jinx things.
Absolutely. Understand.
Yeah.
That's awesome, though.